There we go. All right, so welcome back to another episode of Unlearn with us. I'm really excited to introduce my next guest. Dwayne Matthews is in Toronto, and I've got from his website, I couldn't do a better job, so I copied and pasted just to be clear. So Dwayne Matthews is a Chief Innovation Evangelist and Future of Education Strategist. He helps school boards, educators, and parents understand new and evolving themes in the 21st century, the future of work, which I have just recently become obsessed with, and how to help prepare children to thrive in a rapidly evolving digital information-driven world. Dwayne, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate you giving me the opportunity to speak with you today.
Wonderful. So tell us a little bit about yourself. I often ask people to tell us about, your background, where you came from, your relationship with education as a student, and how you got into education yourself.
Yeah, no, sure. So I started teaching probably about 2000, maybe 1999, 2000, I believe. It's a little while ago now. I taught grades 3, 4, 5, 6, and a little bit of library. I did a chunk of that in Toronto at an inner city school in Toronto that's now closed. After I left, it closed. I don't know if that was because I left or...
Yeah, they missed you.
Wow. I mean, maybe they might have just thought, gosh, it's time for us to do something else. But then I also did 2 years in South America. I taught in Lima, Peru at a school called Franklin D. Roosevelt, which is probably one of the top, at least it was one of the top private schools at the time on the planet, and definitely in South America. It was probably ranked number 3 or number 4 in South America. I did that for a couple of years, and then I had an epiphany, and I did something completely different. I went into technology transfer and technology scouting, and what we did was we looked for any paradigm shifting technology that would shift a particular industry. And so we did a lot of work for oil and gas companies, for mining companies, looking for clean technologies, clean technology experts, and any sort of clean technology patents that they would be able to use to help them in the future, sort of clean up their act. Interestingly enough, a lot of people don't realize that some of the largest investors in clean technology are actually oil and gas companies.
Huh.
A little known fact. And so we did that for a bit. I exited that company. Nothing super exciting. There's nothing Italian parked in the driveway, but it allowed me to go on and start something different. And I started another company that looked a lot like Google Plus. Our failure was probably a lot more spectacular than theirs. And, licking my wounds, I really sat back and thought, gosh, what really gets me up in the morning? And what I realized was the connection between education and fourth industrial revolution technologies and how that impacted economy, I realized was a blind spot and something that I was terribly passionate about speaking about all the time. And so I started to drive my career into that particular space. I did a little bit of work where I consult with a pretty large textbook publishing company. I also do a little bit of consulting on future of education technologies, AI, voice-enabled technologies with a group called Global DWS, and a number of other consulting opportunities. I also have a segment on CTV or morning. I have a segment on Marilyn Dennis sometimes, and do a number of podcasts and speak and that sort of stuff. But that's sort of what brought me here now. And my latest excitement is something called Tomorrow Now Learning Labs. And what that is really a demonstration of what's possible in the world of education as we connect the future of education to the future of work.
That's crazy. So when you were talking about your going from teaching into the sort of the tech industry, how did you make that switch? Did you just one day decide I'm going to apply for this job? How did that?
Well, that's great. And it's a great question. And I didn't actually apply for the job. because there was no job to apply for, I actually created a
Okay.
company, and I'll tell you what happened. I was in South America at the time, and we were driving to the Amazon jungle. And when we drive to the Amazon jungle from Lima, Peru, you have to go through these crazy switchbacks, and you go over probably what's the highest road in the world. And you go through a town called La Oroya. And if you Google La Oroya, you'd realize that it is one of the, 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 the most polluted cities or towns. And a lot of that was due to mining. So I had a conversation there with the people, and I was really sort of moved by the experience because probably about 90% of all the kids had mercury levels that were way too high. It was a very, very sad sort of environment to be in. And, my North American mindset was like, we need to boycott. And the people there said to me, no, we actually don't need boycotting, because then we'll have no jobs. What we actually need is for the mining companies to become cleaner. And from that, I left and I went back and I thought, you know what, I have to do something. And while I was in Peru, I realized that the people that, the people that were at the schools, I had a much different perception as to who they were going to be. The school was very wealthy. People owned gold mines, lots of private jets, armed security. And so I had a preconceived notion as to what I would run up against. And what I found was, if I looked just beyond the surface, I started to see things that I thought were actually reasonably interesting. They pretty much bottled networking, and they used networking to create value. And I thought that was really interesting, and they were extremely hardworking. Just about everybody worked a 12, 13-hour job, regardless of whether they were the CEO of a bank, or someone's nanny. And so that was really sort of interesting to me. And so I came back and I realized, if I could create networks and I could bottle those networks, I could find technologies and move those technologies back and forth through the networks. And that's precisely what I did. I partnered with one of the largest technology transfer hubs, and I started my own company with a partner, and we essentially found clean technology in Canada, and we connected them to large Fortune 500 companies, Suncor, Procter and Gamble, Barrett Gold, just to name a few. But that's essentially how we made that pivot. And I learned on the job. I learned just about everything on the job. Every phone call meant, maybe 20, 30 minutes of Googling, and a lot of late nights just sort of studying what was the best way to do what we were doing.
Wow, that is amazing. That is everything that I'm, working with my students, and looking at possibilities and entrepreneurship, and I mean social entrepreneurship. That is it right there. That's amazing. I feel like we're gonna have to have a conversation, you know, off record, about that. You mentioned the fourth industrial revolution. And when you said that, I don't know if you saw me, but I was really excited. That is something that I've just recently, I would say in the last year or two, really started to research and try to understand, as part of my philosophy, my teaching philosophy, trying to make sure that we are preparing these kids for, not necessarily preparing them because we don't necessarily know what to prepare them for, but being able to teach them to be flexible and adaptable and all those types of things. I think my next question, I'm going to guess that you're going to talk a little bit about this, so I'm excited. So it says on your website, you ask, are we preparing students for 2019 or 2030? Can you elaborate on that and tell us, what is your answer to that particular question?
Sure. And so let's go back to what you talked about, the fourth industrial revolution, and we think just before that, the third industrial revolution. So once upon a time, 98% of the planet was farmers. And so we farmed because, what's the most important thing that we do? The most important thing that we do is we eat and we breathe. And so it made sense that a lot of us were farmers. And we leveraged a very innovative piece of technology. The technology was created 600 years prior, and it was cutting edge. And what it allowed us to do is it allowed us to take the imagination of people from all different places across space and time and transfer that learning and build upon that learning. And so we put that technology into a strategy. We called it School, and that technology specifically was called a printed book. And we developed an entire society around the printed book. And it allowed us to do all kinds of wonderful things because we moved from 98% farming to 2% farming. And once we moved to 2% farming, the fear was, we're all going to starve. But actually, what's happened is we have more food than we need. We don't have a food problem. We have a food distribution problem. Most people in North America spend a significant amount of their time and energy trying not to become obese, trying not to become diabetic because of the amount of food that we've created. And we've also created many, many different things. And so in terms of what we did was we created a system that was based on a factory model to prepare our students for a factory-like economy, right? So you went through a gauntlet, and that gauntlet was because of the limitation of the technology. And that technology allowed you to go through different stage gates, 192 days at a time. We call those stage gates grades. We eventually get you into some kind of post-secondary. And if you're really, really good at this particular system, you got somewhere to a master's degree or a terminal degree, which is called a PhD. And then we took those students and we slotted them based on how well they did into our economy. So if you did really well, you got your MBA, you ended up, maybe you were a senior manager and you had an opportunity to basically manage the factory. And then there's middle manager, and then there's a sort of a factory-like level. And if we look, we realize that much of our work is set up like this. The factory is set up this way, the office is set up this way, and it was very efficient for the system and the technology that we had opportunities to use. What we find now is that we have the digital transformation of information, which allows for an exponential amount of technology that is democratized in terms of the types of ways that we get access to it, right? So once upon a time, when I was dating my wife, I used to make these little mixtapes, and the mixtapes, the radio that I used had 137,000 transistors, right? My phone today has about 8.3 billion transistors on a single chip, and we make millions of those, and there are millions and millions of people that have access to them. So this really changes the dynamic of information and how information moves. And so the future of work really has to do with the digital transformation of work and the digital transformation of our economy altogether. And so if our economy is transforming digitally at an exponential rate, typically every 18 to 24 months, then are we still using 600-year-old technology that was placed into a 150-year-old strategy? Is it still the most efficient way for us to prepare, giving the paradigm shifting technologies that are there? And so that really sort of changes the idea. So when we ask the question, are we preparing for 2019 or 2030? It really is, are we preparing children to be really successful yesterday? Or are we preparing them for the possibilities of tomorrow? Now, a lot of people say, we don't know what tomorrow is going to look like. And I agree, but there's something that doesn't change. And what doesn't change is the types of jobs that we need to get done. And let me explain what I mean by that. Once upon a time, I needed to get from point A to point B. And so I got up and I walked. And it may have taken me my whole lifetime to walk across the continent of North America. And eventually, I still needed to get from A to B, but I discovered the horse. And so now I hop on a horse and I can get there a little bit faster. Eventually, along comes Henry Ford, and he says, you know what, I'm going to give you a car. And I can get to A to B a little bit faster. Then comes a plane. I can get to A to B a little bit faster. Now comes digital. And maybe I don't even need to get to A to B at all, because what I really wanted to do was to connect with people, and I can do that with you now. And so the job that we are trying to get done hasn't changed. And I think that is going to remain pretty consistent. And so then we can use that to give us a little bit of a clue as to what tomorrow is going to look like.
Okay, yes. So now that you say that, you're talking about school system and how it was developed 600 years ago, I guess.
150 years ago.
Okay,
The book was developed,
okay, got it.
yeah, 600 years ago.
So yes, so how do we change something that's so massive? You know, we were talking just before this, you know, how in public education, you know, you can attempt to experiment and try and push the limits and that type of thing, but you're still up against this historical system that is so massive, right? To be one person in there. Like, how do we make this shift? How do we give our youth of today the opportunity that you're talking about?
So I think there are a few things that have to happen. I think one is understanding how change happens itself. And, you know, a lot of people spend time saying, Dwayne, I don't like the system. I go, our education system is fantastic for 2011 and before. You know, it's done a great job in terms of what we needed. We had a limited piece of technology that we couldn't carry with us, right? If you can imagine, you know, if you wanted to find out about something, you had to go to the library. I had to go to the library and I had to get a book. And so I was always taught to have lots of books. So my dream in life was to have a big library in my house. And so I have books everywhere in the house. I have books in drawers, books on desks, books on, but how many books could I travel with? I can't travel with more than 10 books if I'm going on a plane,
Mm-hmm.
right? But you know, with this device, I could travel with all the books ever made anywhere.
Yeah.
I could travel with all music. I could travel with all the podcasts. I could travel with everything, essentially. All right. You know, there's 11 trillion interactions on there per second, right? So it's actually quite vast what we can do. And so now that that's changed, I think that's the first piece to understand is that, you know, the system itself is not a bad thing. It was built to be very stable, and it was very efficient. So how does the system itself change? Well, the system itself changes when we start to have signals that we have to respond to. So right now, you know, as a high school teacher, most high school teachers are really trying to push their kids to get to post-secondary education. And post-secondary education is, you know, essentially one assessment, two assessments, three assessments, all the way to the end. And when we put all your assessments together, we look at what percentage you get, and then we place you in a post-secondary institute. The top institutes, we call them universities, and only about 35% of the population go into those universities. And then the next, we sort of, we spread out across the other post-secondary type institutions. And so I think what will have to change is if that's no longer the most efficient way for us to increase our probability of success, then we'll start to see lots of options. And so we're starting to see that now. You know, the internet, the pandemic has sort of exposed a lot of things. Students will start to find teachers all over the world that they really like. They'll start to get signals from the world of work. The first signal that I've seen that I think is actually a profound shift was Google. Google came out a few weeks ago and they said, we're going to have a $300 course. It's going to take you 6 months. And at the end of 6 months, if you do well at this course, you know, you're going to have a shot at a $92,000 US job, regardless of where you are on the planet. Now, $92,000 US is a lot of money in North America. It's even more money anywhere else in the world. And so all of a sudden, you have the option of you can take a 4-year degree, and this 4-year degree might cost you 100 grand, and you come out with a probability, or you can take a 6-month that costs you 300 bucks, and you have a much higher probability of success. I think we'll start to see companies enter the market this way because a lot of companies have a challenge with the skills gap and the future of work, and that's not being met at the high school and university level. So Google has done so. I've noticed that Disney has a leadership management program that they've come out with at $199. There are a number of organizations that are really starting to think about how do we start looking at getting our students earlier than the 4 years, because we need to secure the best and the brightest in that particular space. And I think once that starts to happen, the end starts to shift. All of a sudden, a lot of parents and students will realize, you know what, we have opportunities. And the kids are sort of like a canary in the coal mine, right? Like, there are a lot of kids that are out there like, I want to be a YouTuber. And, you know, look at this person's making $10 million YouTubing. And parents will rightfully say, well, everybody's not going to make that much money. There's only a handful. But when you go down a layer, you can find a lot of people making $150,000 on YouTube, delivering into a niche. You can find a lot of people making $100,000 doing a podcast. You can find a lot of people that are actually creating entrepreneurial endeavors that are online that may not be making $1 billion, but they're making a really comfortable life for themselves, and on their own time and on their own sort of rules. And so I really think that we're going to start seeing that emerging slowly but surely. The actual large system itself changing at once, I'm not sure that's the best thing to happen anyway. I think we're going to have lots of little experiments that slowly get pulled into the system until the system starts to transform itself.
It's interesting that you say that. I got another interview lined up with a gentleman in the States, and he's created a company, and he used himself as a test product, where he got a degree by finding employers who would pay for his degree. So I think he actually has 2 different business degrees, but did it by working. So a similar situation to like what you're saying with Google, like, come here, we'll you know, you take your $300 course, and then we'll go from there. It's I think there's, you know, just for me, like, I've started up this school, and, you know, I've had a lot of conversations with homeschoolers and unschoolers and lots of different alternative schools. And one of the biggest issues that society has with the homeschooling is, well, they're not going to have a diploma. Well, how are they going to get into university? And the more and more I dig into it, you don't need a diploma to get into university if that's what you want to do. But it's the same idea, as that societal shift in recognizing that, you know, university degree is not the be all and end all anymore. I think that's hard, just because I know growing up in my own family, my dad went to college. My mom didn't go to university because she was a woman. And so she had 2 older brothers. So she, you know, she's a baby boomer, and she had 2 older brothers who have a master's and a PhD. And mom and dad said, oh, you're a girl, you should just, you know, be a secretary or a teacher, which at that time you didn't need a degree. And so she ended up becoming a teacher, and stayed in the profession. And you know, was a little bit resentful because she couldn't get paid as much. Anyways, long story short, you know, for me it was, you're going to university because that's an opportunity that I didn't have.
Right.
So I think it's just that switch, right? Like that societal switch. And when I still talk to, you know, my friends who have children who are in their teens, they still have the blinders on. It's that, you know, they need that education, and there's nothing wrong with getting an education. But nobody's really sort of looking at those alternative things that you were mentioning.
Well, I think the things are alternative when it doesn't have a place to fit. But what you're going to find is, if you look at the world of work, you realize that the CEOs, one of their biggest concerns is the skills gap.
Yeah.
So a lot of people believe that the automation or digitization of work is going to steal jobs. But actually, if we go with the analogy that I gave before with farming, it's actually going to create a lot of jobs, and it's going to create a lot of jobs where there are no people to fill those jobs. And so that becomes the bigger issue for an employer. So if you look at, you know, somebody coming out of the University of Waterloo, for example, if they're doing, you know, anything in AI and that sort of stuff, like the entry level is pretty high. You know, there are some companies that are saying, hey, we need people in cybersecurity. Like today, if you were to take every single person in cybersecurity today, and you were to place them in a job, we'd still have about 3.5 million jobs open, right? Consider the cybersecurity threat that we now face
Yeah.
in North America, and consider that there's 3 million jobs. I think there's something like 800,000 jobs that are open in Canada. So when you think of that, you realize that, can a company wait 4 to 6 years to have you go through university to come out and say that maybe you're interested in cybersecurity, or
Right.
should they get you right away?
Right.
Right? Particularly when it's an existential threat. It's a
Yeah.
real threat to business, right? Consider a bank, consider, places that hold lots of personal information. Just consider the assault on social media. All these things are things that we are really far behind on, and employers are, I can't wait 6 to 8 years for them to go through and for me to see them on the other side as a PhD to know if they're smart or not.
Right.
Can I figure out if they can do this job sooner rather than later?
Yeah. I heard that, and I don't have any of the particulars, but I remember reading something where there was a particular company that wanted to, who would grab up people who were able to get into Harvard before they actually went to Harvard, because, like you're saying, they knew that they were smart enough to get into Harvard, but they wanted to mold them themselves. Like, come and work for me, and we'll, rather than you getting a Harvard degree, we'll mold you to what we need here and give you the skills.
Well, and what's even more interesting is, as we start to understand a bit more about a brain, and we start to understand about the myth of meritocracy in school, right? So when people say, is somebody smart enough, like, we're thinking there's meritocracy involved. We're starting at the same line, we're running the same race. But when we really pay attention to that, we realize that there's an elephant in the room. That's not really true. Is there meritocracy in effort? Yes, probably. In terms of resources and time, definitely not. Everybody's going to have some different, whether that be class, whether it be race, whether it just be, two parents at home, two parents educated at home, mom and dad having time. There are a number of different reasons as to why someone is going to be different. And, I sort of challenge teachers, and I say, imagine, I have a son, my son is 11, so that would put him officially in grade 6, but he reads at a grade 9, does math at a grade 7, and writes at about a grade 4, grade 5, right? But can talk to an adult. So what grade is he in?
Right.
And why would we try to level that out across 192 days in an age-based group?
Yeah.
And if we did that, do we run the risk of not maximizing his potential? Now, he's not unique in that sense. That's everybody.
Yeah.
So if everybody's like that, and we've been trying to pretend that everybody starts the same place, is at the same place, and should move at the same time 192 days at a time, then we're going to be inefficient. And we know we're inefficient because we only have about a 30%, 35% entry into post-secondary. Ontario is a bit rare at 69%, but that's primarily because of our really advanced immigration policies, right? But most places in the world get into university about 35%. And so the question is, are we optimizing, right? All those brains, are we leaving value on the table? And the answer is yes, we're leaving a lot of value on the table.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's a good segue into the next question. So you mentioned your son there, and I have been following you on Instagram and LinkedIn, and more so on Instagram. I think you've been posting a lot about sort of your homeschooling experience with your children. I noticed that there's a big focus on mindfulness. I'm interested in hearing, you've got all this perspective on education. Now you've got your children. Have your children always been homeschooled?
So no, and I mean, I wouldn't even classify myself as a homeschooler. I actually haven't spent a lot of time speaking to a lot of homeschoolers. So what we did is, our son's gone to a number of different educational facilities, and we wanted to give him a lot of different perspectives on learning itself. So he started off in Montessori.
Okay.
Then we went into the public school, and we were there in the public school. Then we went into French immersion.
Okay.
And now with the pandemic, we realized, this year is sort of going to be a wash. in terms of official schooling. We're going to be in and out and in and out, and there's going to be all kinds of undulations
Mhm.
over the next 12 to 18 months. So we realized, you know what, let's look at some of the evidence-based things that we know about, that we can do. Both my wife and I are teachers, and then we came up with the Tomorrow Now Learning Lab. So the idea of the Tomorrow Now Learning Lab is for us to start with just my son, but eventually move to 10 students,
Okay.
move from 10 to 20, but to have that across time and space. So we really wanted to create an opportunity where, you know, there may be some kids in a whole other country, in a whole other school, in a whole other class, in a whole other place that he could interact with. And then over here, and really a large part of that was the evidence-based research, but then watching him go through the social experiment of Minecraft, right? And so him and his friends, you know, at the beginning of the pandemic, it was, you know, what are they going to do for social? They're all locked up in the house. And then they found themselves on Minecraft. They had FaceTime. And then they started to connect with different kids. And then they started to do projects together. And then they started to move through this digital space. And they would be laughing. And one time I came into the room and I said, "What are you guys doing?" They're like, "We're playing hide and seek." And it really sort of opened up my brain to, oh my gosh, they're playing hide and seek,
Yeah.
right? In Minecraft, using FaceTime, listening to music on someone's YouTube channel, while they built a server to get all this stuff done. And I thought, we're light years behind. And so that's sort of the impetus of the Tomorrow Now Learning Lab. Now, one of the main components of that is mindfulness. I think, you know, we know that when we're taking in an amount of information that we can process, we feel that we're in control. We become overwhelmed if we feel we're taking in too much information, right? And so if you think of video games, social media, news, if you think of the amount of information that we start taking in, we're taking in a lot of information. And typically what happens is when we become overwhelmed, the the resources from our prefrontal cortex kind of slip in to our limbic system, and we become highly reactive, become a little bit more anxious, and it's harder for us to make clear decisions. And so I believe that one of the most important pieces is to counteract that. And I've been following the work coming out of Harvard around mindfulness. I spent a little bit of time with Dr. Faubert, who is a marvelous neuroscientist out at the University of Montreal. I spent a little bit of time working with him for about 24 months and looking at how do you enhance executive function? How do you increase mental readiness? Essentially, how do you slow down time? And one of the key pieces to that is mindfulness. So I think mindfulness is something that, you know, started on the outer edges, was sort of legitimized by Harvard. And the more research we see, the more we realize that it is just as important as physical education in terms of mental health, particularly in a digital age. So we do mindfulness every morning for 10 to 15 minutes. And we're going to expand on some of those projects when we think about how do we enhance the actual cognitive abilities themselves? How do we help you to slow time down? How do we help you to process information faster, select your attention, sustain your attention for longer periods of time? Because there's so many distractions. And so this is a key piece to that work.
As I'm listening, I'm thinking of my 12-year-old daughter who we just allowed her to get a cell phone. So it's just, we cut her off at certain points. And I think she could definitely use some of that mindfulness piece.
Mhm.
Say again that it's the Tomorrow Now Learning Lab. Is that what it's called?
Yeah, the Tomorrow Now Learning Lab. And so the
Okay.
Tomorrow Now Learning Lab is a demonstration. And so what do we do? What are we demonstrating? Well, we take a particular mental framework or series of mental frameworks, and we combine them. And once we combine them, then we go out and we think about what technological tools do we need to help us to get a particular job done, right? So, you know, some of the tools that we use a digital learning ecosystem that has Canadian curriculum across all the provinces from grade 6 to grade 11.
Mhm.
It's inside of an interesting UI, and it plugs into all these different applications to help. And what students are able to do is they're able to create their paths into something called collections.
Mhm.
And once they create a path based on interest, we can now track which curriculum pieces that they have and what are some of the gaps, and we can fill those gaps in. So it really is a co-creation, but we allow it to be a bit more student-led. So if my son wants to push forward into grade 11 language, he's free to do so. But if he's still trying to fill gaps at, grade 6 math, then he's free to do that as well. It really helps to get him to where he is, and helps to give insight into that. The other piece that we use is we use another piece of technology that allows for critical reflection. And so it's a peer selection or peer assessment. And so essentially what you do is you create any piece of work, and that piece of work can be put up against a rubric or a success criteria, and you move it through your friends anonymously, and everybody gives you feedback. And so that feedback is critical feedback based specifically on the success criteria, and you yourself are giving your friends feedback. So you're in this constant loop of cognitively always reflecting on, where is my work? How well have I done? How does it connect to somebody else's? What examples can I take? So how can I ask myself great questions? How can I think about what success criteria is? And how can I balance against those? And then the last is we use immersive technology and gamification. So how do we use immersive technology and gamification to really enhance cognitive function, cognitive abilities?
Cool. Yes. Everything I want to get a list of all those different applications that you're using. I'm just, the wheels are going on how I can bring that into my classes. Okay, last question. So I first came across you on LinkedIn when you had posted about a roundtable discussion with Justin Trudeau. So I'm curious about what that was all about, and Justin Trudeau's thoughts on education.
So, we had a roundtable, and the roundtable probably had 6 to 7 people. Had an opportunity to talk to them about a number of different things. So, they talked about anti-systemic, systemic racism, anti-Black racism, entrepreneurship, and one of the components was education. And so my conversation with him was really concise and to the point. And I said that education is less about teaching children how to read, and it's more about enhancing or optimizing the productivity of the country. And some people say, well, Dwayne, that sounds really cold. And I said, well, actually, no. If the productivity is not optimized, then we don't have all these things around us, and we can't self-actualize in life. So we sort of need to make sure that it's optimized. We need to make sure that the level or standard of living raises for a vast majority of the population. And the best way for us to do that is through education. And so I said, it's great that we're putting money into education now during the pandemic, but we have to be very cautious that we're not getting our schools to look more and more like 1918. If you look at pictures of the Spanish flu pandemic, and you look at pictures as to what school looks like today in the pandemic, besides the fact that one's a black and white picture and one's not, it's sort of hard to tell that we're looking at 102 years. And, think 102 years in any industry, in any location, in any direction. Gosh, if you think 11 years from now, when I had my son, some of the pictures are stuck on a BlackBerry, right? And I pulled out my BlackBerry, and he's like, why are there 3 letters on one button? Like, that doesn't make any sense. I go in, right? And here we are now with thousands and thousands of pictures of his sister, because it's accessible, right? So if you think about how big that change is, if you think about, there was no Zoom, right? Like, this is Star Trek,
Yes.
Right? And we're not even amazed, right?
Yeah.
So if you think 100 years back, it's a big space. So we are spending money doing that, and I think it creates a national security risk for us. I think if we do not stay on top of it, we run the risk of reducing our influence on the planet. We run the risk of reducing our productivity and our standard of living, and that's a precarious situation. So I think what we want to do is we really want to think about how do we leverage what we have. And you know, I go Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal. Um, I go our hubs for the world. We are some of the most diverse places on the planet. And that diversity is not necessarily altruistic. I don't see diversity as an altruistic endeavor. I see it as a means for us to maximize this productivity and to really raise the standard of living for everybody. And I genuinely trust that more because it'll last longer, right? If we can make connections into almost every country in the world, business-wise connections, we know that any of those types of connections enhance or increase the opportunity for peaceful prosperity. And we have an opportunity to do that, and we almost have an obligation to lead the world into the next piece, because it's, you know, it's a unique experiment that's happening here in Canada, you know, Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver specifically, you know, Ottawa. It's a very unique experiment, Canada, and you know, it's not perfect by any means, but we are probably decades ahead of anybody that's reasonably close. I mean, decades ahead. And so we have a real opportunity to have that kind of an influence. And I think that really stems from how do we position our education over the next 10 to 20 years.
And what did Trudeau have to say about that?
You know, the one thing that I remember that he said was, he goes, we have to build back better, and we have to not go back to school, but go forward to school.
Right.
And so I think, you know, that was something that resonated from the conversation. I think was a good piece. And I mean, you know, I'm sure he's spoken to hundreds of people since then, but I hope that piece sort of resonated. And I think what's important is, you know, I have an experiment going, and I think it's important to have as many of these experiments as possible. I had a conversation this morning with a gentleman in New Zealand and somebody in Ireland. Last week, you know, conversations with people in China, conversations with people in Singapore. So all over the world, these experiments are happening, and we need more of them to start happening here. Because I think we're going to find that slowly but surely things start gelling, and you know, we're going to start to create something that's new, that really optimizes education and really provides our children with an opportunity to co-create the type of world that they would like to see and we would like to see. And that's exciting.
That is very exciting. And you've put a very positive spin, because I feel like sometimes we can, in my situation, it becomes a bit frustrating when you are trying new things and you don't see the progress, right? You kind of bang your head against the wall and come up against some resistance. But I think you've put a really, really positive outlook and given me some more motivation to continue with my own experiment and to continue. And you know, you've got a big focus there on everything that you're doing on that networking piece and finding other people. And that's kind of been my saving grace, is using technology to find other people, other organizations, other places in the world that are doing the same thing. So I really appreciate that.
Well, here, and I'll leave you with this thought, right? So you're starting a virtual school, and currently on the planet, there's just over 1 billion students on the planet, right? You know, so for you to make the school a success, how many students would you need if you think 3 billion people are connected to the web? So 3 billion people connected to the web, you could probably be a flying success for the rest of your life if you got 500 people, right? So if you think of the size of pool that you're pulling from, you know, could you find 500 parents that thought exactly the way that you do about education? You most certainly can. So what you have to do is really put up the signals for those people to be able to find you, because they're out there and they're looking for you right now, right? There are lots of parents that are sitting that are frustrated, and they're looking for you right now. They would love to know about your school. They'd love to know exactly as you are, exactly as you see it, not even making any shifts left or right. exactly as you see it right now. They're out there looking for you, and your job is just to connect with them, and to let them know, hey, I'm over here. And that's really, really exciting, right? Like that's an exciting problem to have, because you can do that relatively cheaply sitting right in your house. And so that's a tremendous amount of impact that you can have. So typically what I find is a lot of people, Dwayne, have you talked to the superintendent, to the Ministry of Education, and that sort of stuff? And I go, those people are going to do exactly what they're supposed to do, and which is good. I don't have a problem with that at all. But in terms of, folks like yourself that have these innovative experiments, there are a lot of people that are looking for you right now, that are looking for the opportunities. And it really is just about finding the right signals in society and time that will allow the parents to say, you know what, I am comfortable with the fact. I'll leave you with this. I said to parents, I go, when I went to school, the job was to get from K to university degree as quickly as humanly possible, right? So, parents would always come and say, are they really smart? Did he skip ahead, right? Like I have come, they skipped a grade, and everybody's, yeah, they skipped a grade. It was really exciting, right? So, but that's because university came to an end. And so then you left university and you started your real life. But life's not like that now, right? So life is, you may come to the end of university, your whole industry could get blown away tomorrow by a COVID-22. And all of a sudden, you have to go back, and you may go back to school, and it may take you, somebody asked me to do a consulting project that I didn't really know that much about. I took 2 weeks and I did like a 17-hour deep dive into maybe 3 or 4 online courses, and came up and said, okay, I'm 75% sure that I can deliver on some success here. And this is where my 25% is lacking. And they said, no problem, you can learn that on the job. I go, that's going to happen over and over and over again all the time. So once we realized that, we realized, you know what, that's actually good. There's no rush.
Right.
Start your life. You could start your life at 17, right? Like, I want to become a DJ. I'm like, go for it. If he fails, then go for something else, right?
Yeah.
But we now have those kinds of opportunities, and they're becoming more and more democratized over time. And so, I explained to some parents. They said, I don't think my son's teacher likes him. What should I do? I said, how close are you to the library? They're like, pretty close. I'm like, okay, how close are you to Starbucks, coffee time, anything with Wi-Fi? I go, could you sit outside and pick up Wi-Fi? Yeah. I go, then you can do school from K to university right now. K to university, right? So really, then what becomes the issue? The issue becomes, how do we help children learn how to learn, and how do we help them tap into that while they're pursuing a passion? Because the content itself is a commodity, and they can change based on what they need. If they wanted to be a rapper and realize, you know what, I'm not that good at rapping, maybe I want to do something else, they just need to know how to learn.
Yeah.
Because then they can say, okay, well, I want to get into music management, make a complete pivot. Okay, I want to, you know what, I saw this thing on physics, I really like physics, make a complete pivot. You're able to do these things now, which was, virtually impossible when, at least when I went to school, is virtually impossible maybe 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Right? I go, so we can do that now. And so it's really about teaching kids how to learn and how to tap into loving learning, so they can do these deep dives.
Amazing. There's so many questions. I think we could even do a part 2, because there's so many things that you touched on there that I want to go further, but I don't want to take too much of your time. If people want to find out more about you and what you do and all that stuff, where's the best place for them to find you?
So the best places to find me, LinkedIn is probably where I spend a lot of my time in terms of social media. I don't spend as much time on Facebook. I pop up there every now and then. But I spend a lot of time on LinkedIn, a lot of time on Instagram. TomorrowNowLearningLab.com is also another great place to find me, or DwayneMatthews.life. So that's pretty much everything. Other than that, if you have a homing pigeon, fly it into Toronto, and I'll be able to pull down the message from somewhere. But you know what? I want to say thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to have this conversation. with you, and I'm really excited to see what you do with your school. I think it's terribly exciting what you're doing, and I look forward to learning more about that.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. We're definitely going to have some conversations about how to get those signals out there. I think maybe you might have a few tricks in your hat that you might be able to let me know. But yes,
Happy to share.
yes, thanks so much, and enjoy your sunny day there.
Thank you very much. It's the last one of the week. I think we're going to be all rainy and cloudy by the next few days, so we'll see.